Western civilization was primarily built on two foundations: the Judeo-Christian religious tradition of theism and revelation, and the Greek influence of rational investigation and artistic creativity. The Greeks were people who took pride in humanity and its achievements. Many pursued wisdom strictly through philosophy and science. The Jews and Christians, however, viewed philosophy and science through the lens of divine revelation. They looked to the Scriptures to guide them in how they should view the world, as well as how they should live and treat others. During the 1500 years following Christ's life on earth, Christianity spread, becoming the dominant religion in Western civilization. During this time, atheism and religious skepticism were rare. In the 17th and 18th centuries, during the time known as the Age of Enlightenment, there was a great increase in two major philosophies: rationalism and empiricism. Rationalism is the belief that all claims of truth should be judged solely by human reason, without any appeal to divine revelation. Empiricism is the belief that knowledge is gained primarily through human experience, through the five senses: touching, tasting, hearing, smelling, and seeing. This view is sometimes called scientism. Rationalism and empiricism seek knowledge by first rejecting the reality of divine revelation. It was also during this time that modern science was born, largely due to the biblical worldview. The biblical worldview has always held that the universe was created by a rational and orderly creator, and thus could be understood through scientific investigation. However, as scientific investigation continued to uncover the mysteries of the universe, some people began to believe that divine revelation from God was impractical or even impossible. Scientists and philosophers began to challenge the Scriptures. The Church, mistakenly thinking that some claims were at odds with biblical revelation, overreacted in its attempt to protect the authority of the Scriptures. To the world, it seemed to imply that faith could not withstand rational scrutiny or scientific investigation. It took some time to distinguish between legitimate discoveries and faulty speculations, and to reconcile the valid scientific discoveries with biblical truths. The new scientific discoveries of the 17th and 18th centuries led many people to a sense of great self-confidence. Religious beliefs began to lose importance in many people's lives. They began to think that all of life's mysteries could, and eventually would, be solved by science and the human intellect. Christianity was openly attacked and often disregarded as simply unimportant. Some intellectuals equated Christianity with superstition and ignorance. Many of these intellectuals called themselves theists, but their God didn't reveal himself or intervene in the world through miracles. They were, in fact, deists. Men such as Sir Isaac Newton and Thomas Jefferson placed their confidence in the powers of the human intellect and downplayed the truthfulness and authority of the Bible. Another proponent of such a view was Voltaire, one of the most influential intellectuals to make a full-scale attack on Christianity. He was not an atheist, but he believed that God did not intrude in the affairs of the world. Voltaire thought that the Bible was a particularly evil influence on society. He proclaimed, "This is what fools have written, what imbeciles comment, what rogues teach, and what young children are made to learn by heart." And the scholar who is filled with indignation and who is irritated by the most abominable absurdities that have ever disgraced human nature is called blasphemer. It was fashionable to scoff at organized religion. Religious symbols were sometimes outlawed, and the church was harassed. Christianity's influence was diminishing.
The secularist ideas of the Enlightenment took root within the spheres of higher education and continued to grow in spite of the widespread religious revivals that occurred under such preachers as John Wesley, George Whitefield, and Jonathan Edwards.
In 1859, Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species. His theory of evolution shook the world and offered a foundation for worldviews without God. The ideas of Karl Marx, Frederick Nietzsche, and Sigmund Freud also encouraged atheism. When combined with Darwin's theory, human experience could be explained solely through economic necessity, biological evolution, and sexual urges. By the end of the 19th century, the major components of secular humanism were well formed and common, both in Europe and America. As these ideas spread, Christians often retreated from the cultural centers of society, opening the door to secular humanist thought. Humanist ideas moved freely into all areas of life. They became entrenched as the dominant worldview in American society. Christians had virtually abandoned these areas, mistakenly separating their religious lives from their secular lives. In 1933, the first Humanist Manifesto was published. The manifesto made it explicitly clear that God has no place in the secular humanist worldview, though humanism was still considered to be religious in nature. In 1973, Paul Kurtz, editor of Free Inquiry and one of today's leading secular humanists, drafted the Humanist Manifesto II. It proclaims, "No deity will save us. We must save ourselves." Many influential thinkers and educators signed these manifestos. John Dewey, Charles Francis Potter, Isaac Asimov, Corliss Lamont, B.F. Skinner, Julian Huxley, and Betty Friedan, among others. Many eminent scholars, educators, and other influential people have also been nominated as Humanists of the Year by the American Humanist Association. Individuals such as well-known authors and scientists Linus Pauling, Carl Sagan, and Isaac Asimov. Famed psychologists and psychotherapists Carl Rogers, Erich Fromm, B.F. Skinner, and Abraham Maslow. Many influential feminists were also nominated, such as Mary Calderon, Betty Friedan, and Margaret Sanger. Ted Turner, the media mogul and founder of CNN, was nominated as well. Secular humanists have influenced every area of society and education.
A shift has occurred in the way much of America thinks. Humanistic ideologies dominate most cultural and professional arenas, such as education, literature, the government, law, and the media. In order to turn back the floodwaters of secularist ideologies, it is essential to understand the secular humanistic worldview.
The secular humanist worldview continues to develop, but its foundation remains the same. Its theology is atheism, its philosophy is naturalism, and its ethics are relativism. Secular humanists base their biology on Darwinian evolution, their psychology on monistic self-actualization, and their sociology on a more open definition of family, a world state, and ethical society. Secular humanists hold to man-made or positive law. They base their politics on a notion of world government. Many base their economics on socialism, and their view of history is historical evolution. The theological perspective of secular humanism is atheism. Nearly all modern-day humanists are atheists.
Every philosophy starts with an assumption about ultimate reality. What is the ultimate real? What philosophers call, what is your ontology, your metaphysics? And certainly secular humanism starts with the assumption that there is no God, that the universe created itself in some way, is self-generating, has evolved from chaos into order, that living things evolved from the slime. And it's because they believe there is no need for God to create the universe, that therefore the ultimate source of truth and knowledge is humans, and humans are the only rational beings on the earth.
Isaac Asimov, the well-known author and former president of the American Humanist Association, declared, "I am an atheist out and out." Atheism permeates their writings and literature. They argue that science and the scientific process have rendered the idea of God obsolete.
I'm a skeptical atheist. I'm an agnostic. I've looked at the God question. I've examined whether God exists. I've examined the revelation of the Bible. And I don't think the case has been made using science. Therefore, I would consider myself as an agnostic basically, but do not believe there is sufficient evidence for the claims of theism, so I'm a non-theist.
Corliss Lamont, author of The Philosophy of Humanism, asserted, "There is no place in the humanist worldview for either immortality or God." Humanism contends that instead of the gods creating the cosmos in the form of human beings given rein to their imagination, created the gods. The Humanist Manifesto, too, is even stronger in its rejection of God. we can discover no divine purpose or providence for the human species. While there is much that we do not know, humans are responsible for what we are or will become. No deity will save us. We must save ourselves.
To say we must save ourselves, I mean we must solve our own problems, create our own futures. Now, the great problem is ecological. We must save the earth, its population, runaway population. We must limit population. So to say that we must save ourselves, I mean, you can't look outside, in my view, for divine salvation. We have to use the best intelligence and the best cooperation and the best resolve to solve our problems, save the earth, and improve human life.
Atheism is the beginning and end of secular humanism's theological foundation. Secular humanists spread their atheistic message into the popular culture through their major periodicals, The Humanist and Free Inquiry.
Now, while it is true that atheism permeates the literature of secular humanism, and in fact, again, theoretically, is part and parcel of their think tanks and their think tank publications like Free Inquiry magazine and the Humanist magazine, the important thing to remember is that atheism permeates our society through the popular culture. Hollywood, for example, at the base of much of what Hollywood produces is atheism. Very anti-Christian. In fact, Michael Medved has a great book on the subject called Hollywood versus America. The sex industry in this country can be terminated back to the secular humanist theology and atheism. The porno industry, radical feminism, radical homosexuality can be traced back to an atheistic base. But then what about the National Academy of Sciences? According to Phil Johnson, 90% of the leadership of that organization are atheists. Carl Sagan certainly has popularized atheism through his Cosmos series. And then education. Come on. Our public education today is at its root atheistic. There is no God left in the schools. Prayer has been ruled out. The Bible has been ruled out. The Ten Commandments. I mean, it's just one thing after the other. It is very obvious that atheism reigns supreme even in our educational system.
Atheism is foundational not only to secular humanist theology, but also to its philosophy, naturalism.
Naturalism is the view that the physical universe that science studies is all there is. For the naturalist, matter and space and time is all that ever was, all that is now, and all that ever will be. The naturalist also believes that the hard sciences are the only way we have of knowing truth. So if you can test something or prove it in the laboratory by experiment and by measurement in physics and chemistry and in some of the hard sciences like geology, then you can know it's true.
Carl Sagan, the author of Cosmos and the 1981 Humanist of the Year, proclaimed, "The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be." Secular humanists also deny the existence of the mind and soul, since neither can be observed or tested. Ideas, imagination, and even rationality are all viewed as simply side effects of electrochemical reactions in the brain.
Philosophical naturalism simply says that there are no immaterial things. If God's not a material thing, God doesn't exist. Basically, there is no soul, there is no spirit, there are no angels, there is no afterlife, there's no heaven, there's no hell. We are in a physical, naturalistic universe, and by definition, if science can't identify what that is through the scientific method or by reason of some kind, we can deny it.
The philosophy of naturalism elevates man to the level of God, placing him in charge of his own destiny. There is no life after death. Man must focus only on the present material world. Corliss Lamont asserted, if men realize that their careers are limited to this world, then they are already more than halfway on the path toward becoming functioning humanists.
Humanists disagree on how to determine morality and where ethics come from, but most agree on one thing: ethics are relative. Secular humanists work toward developing a morality that is not rooted in the beliefs of creation or revelation. Traditional religious belief has assumed that a deity was both the source and enforcer of the only possible right ethical system. As secular humanists, however, we need to discover a naturalistic explanation for the ethical impulse. Lucia K.B. Hall.
Naturalism in ethics is you're a physical, material being, and there is no absolute right or wrong. There is no transcendent standard. There's nothing even in you, a human nature that would give you some guidance to how you should behave. Instead, it's completely up to your own choice.
Because secular humanists reject God, there are no universal ethical guidelines. Secular humanist ethics are humanistic ethics, the ethics of man, from man, and for man. Humans determine what is right or wrong. All ethics are relative to people's interpretation and application of them in any given situation. Paul Kurtz even asserts that moral principles should be treated as hypotheses.
So ethics is based on human experience. It's tested by its consequences in life and by the use of reason. It grows out of moral conscious, moral awareness of the needs of others, and it's modified in the light of the best scientific and rational criticism.
This view of ethics is also known as situational ethics, cultural relativism, and the new morality, although in reality this view is not new.
Moral relativism is basically the view that morality evolved and there's nothing that's truly right or wrong, but right and wrong is just relative to individuals or groups. And I think the atheist and the naturalist should hold that morality is primarily a useful social invention to help us survive. Now, it's not clear to me, though, that moral behavior always helps us survive. Sometimes doing the right thing can get you killed. Sometimes doing the wrong thing can help you survive. So I don't think that will justify morality, but that does seem to be the view that many atheists at least ought to hold if they're consistent with their atheism.
This ethical system would allow every individual to express his or her freedom apart from God. These so-called freedoms have especially played out in the realm of human sexuality. Many secular humanists support so-called alternative lifestyles because, they believe, these lifestyles are genetically determined. They view any type of restrictions on sexual behavior as the product of repressive religious systems. Secular humanists largely base their ethics on the belief that man is no more than an animal, created by time, chance, and the evolutionary principle of the survival of the fittest.
Now, if man is an animal, as the secular humanists claim, then they have a problem with a subject that all of us know is rather important, and that's the subject of rape. Animals rape, and therefore the question is, why shouldn't humans rape? And now we have a few evolutionists arguing in favor of rape. And this is going to be a very interesting issue down the road for the secular humanists to handle. If man is an animal and animals rape, then how are the secular humanists going to deny the validity of rape itself?
Without the theory of evolution, there is no secular humanism. While many scientists hold that evolution is a theory, humanists believe evolution is a fact. Evolution is a fact amply demonstrated by the fossil record and by contemporary molecular biology. Natural selection is a successful theory devised to explain the fact of evolution. Carl Sagan. Since God does not exist, and only nature does, then life must have risen from inorganic matter by natural, random means. Man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. He was not planned. He is a state of matter, a form of life, a sort of animal. George Gaylord Simpson. Secular humanists believe that 3 to 4 billion years ago, the first speck of life came into existence by a series of accidental combinations of chemicals and energy. A cell was eventually produced. From that first cell, other cells were created, eventually forming simple plants and animals. Over time, fish formed, which continued to evolve into amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and eventually primates. These primates are the ancestors of man. This entire evolutionary process took place through natural selection and mutation. No supernatural being created or guided the process. Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species Through Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, is an essential book for secular humanists. Darwin insisted that natural selection must take place over long periods of time. It acts solely by accumulating slight, successive, favorable variations. It can produce no great or sudden modification. It can act only by short and slow steps. Most secular humanists implicitly trust Darwin's explanation, although an increasing number are accepting Stephen Jay Gould's more recent and radical theory of punctuated equilibrium. This theory says that species remain the same for great periods of time, but they occasionally and rather abruptly evolve from one species into another.
Evolutionary theory faces problems in every area. It's pretty well known that it doesn't fit the fossil record. The fossil record does not show this pattern of slow, gradual, step-by-step change from one kind of thing into another. It shows variation within the type. Evolutionary naturalism, the Darwinian kind of evolution, doesn't fit the genetic evidence. When you try to test it, you find you can't make the big changes. You just produce birth defects when you induce mutations in organisms. It doesn't face the molecular evidence. Michael Behe has shown how molecular structures are irreducibly complex. You can't build them up by a blind, step-by-step process. So if you go from one area to another, you see it's nothing but problems and evasions, you see, to try to answer the problems. And you go to a scientist in one specialty and he'll say, I know it's all problems here, but after all, they've got it proved in all the other areas. See, so you go to the other areas and you find that it's just as bad or worse. But the worst problem is none of these things that I've mentioned. The worst problem is that living organisms are full of complex operating systems that need a program to direct their operations. Everybody knows there has to be something instructing those billion proteins where to go and what to do. And the evolutionary science has no idea how to construct such a program, no mechanism at all. That's the biggest problem.
The secular humanist worldview is molded by its doctrines of atheism, naturalism, and evolution. This can be seen even in their psychology. Humanists embrace third force psychology, which is based almost exclusively on the work of Abraham Maslow, Rollo May, Erich Fromm, and Carl Rogers. Their psychological goal is known as self-actualization. It focuses on man's inherent goodness and predicts that every individual can achieve mental health simply by getting in touch with and actualizing his real self. Secular humanists call for individuals to become self-actualized by meeting all their personal needs. In essence, this psychology teaches individuals to turn to themselves for answers to their problems.
The secular humanists, psychologically speaking, wrap themselves around the concept of self-actualization. In fact, the humanists love the notion of self. The concept of soul and spirit, even character, is sort of gone by the wayside right now. And the emphasis is on the self, and what they want us to believe is that each self can look inside and try to figure out what's really going on, that we can find out the answers to the world and ethical answers and what's right and what's wrong inside of us. Well, the truth is the self by itself can't give us a whole lot. And even the secular humanists write books for the self to read. So we're actually going outside of ourselves to read their materials as well.
Self-actualization calls for the person struggling with self-esteem to abandon all feelings of inferiority and guilt. Humanist psychologists believe that guilt is forced upon individuals by corrupt social institutions and religious beliefs, and Christianity is the chief culprit. Many secular humanists explain away religious belief as either a symptom or a cause of mental illness. They blame many of society's problems on religion rather than the reality of human sin.
Carl Rogers. Though I am very well aware of the incredible amount of destructive, cruel, malevolent behavior in today's world, I do not find that this evil is inherent in human nature. Humanism decrees that human nature is essentially good and all humans, once free from belief in the supernatural, can become self-actualized, perfected world citizens fit for a new world order. Corliss, Lamont. Human beings possess the power or potential of solving their own problems through reliance primarily upon reason and scientific method applied with courage and vision. Since secular humanists believe that only the physical world exists, that there is not a spiritual side to humans, they have a monistic view of reality. Psychological monism is the belief that all of reality is one substance, and therefore the mind is reduced to nothing more than the physical brain. Dualism, on the other hand, affirms the existence of both the natural and the spiritual. According to secular humanists, monism is the only rational, scientific way to perceive man and his thoughts.
Secular humanists believe that their worldview will ultimately grant humanity the freedom to perfect itself by taking away the social and ideological shackles binding them to the superstitions of the past. By unlocking all of humanity's abilities, they believe we will finally actualize our full potential and create a heaven on earth.
Secular humanist sociology insists on restructuring the family. It calls for the end of the traditional family unit. Humanists believe that traditional views of marriage and the family are too restrictive and oppressive. Mankind cannot achieve its full potential until the family is freed to experiment with openness.
Sociologically speaking, secular humanism has a very weak view of family life, father, mother, and child. In fact, the secular humanists have been behind the feminist movement. They've been behind the homosexual movement. Their view, which they think is somewhat open-ended, resolves, sociologically speaking, into an anti-family position.
Secular humanist sociology looks down on any worldview with dogmatic restrictions against premarital sex, adultery, divorce, pornography, and especially homosexuality. Secular humanism has helped usher in the sexual revolution, including the homosexual revolution and radical feminism.
Where we see that operating most clearly is in the homosexual agenda. The idea that it's just as good for two men or two women to have sex as it is for a man and a woman. Now, Christian people would have cause to argue with that, but if two men want to have sex, that's their choice. However, that's not enough. Now, gay activists want all society to honor that choice and to say, through public law, that this kind of choice is just as good as a man and a woman. And if you look at it through the lens of secular humanism, you have to see, well, yes, it is.
Secular humanism attacks the very core of the biblical view on sex and marriage. Humanists don't believe that sex should be restricted to monogamous, heterosexual marriage. Divorce and abortion are viewed as rights that should be available on demand. The results have been catastrophic. America's illegitimacy rate is reaching 30%. Half of all marriages end in divorce, and tragically, 1.5 million babies are aborted every year. While there may have been other factors that have contributed to the sexual revolution, at its heart and soul was the worldview of secular humanism. The sexual revolution grew out of the belief that people are naturally good. In order to release this goodness, oppressive Judeo-Christian influences, such as the Bible, must be removed. According to secular humanistic sociology, culture shapes the individual. Humans are primarily evil because their cultural and social environments are evil. Humanists also believe that the present society is poorly structured because it does not encourage people to express the proper attitudes and often causes them to repress their better tendencies. The inherent goodness of human nature has been stifled by these influences. Secular humanist sociology calls for social reforms to guarantee man's future tendency for good. The majority of secular humanists believe that laws are determined by society. That is, they believe in man-made law, or positive law. Positive law says that there are no legal absolutes. No laws exist outside of man and society. Secular humanists reject an absolute law code just as they reject an absolute moral code. They believe man is capable of devising his own code. human beings may and do make up their own rules. Max Hokut. Darwin's evolutionary theory has profoundly impacted secular humanist law. Julian Huxley noted, "There proceeded during the 19th century, under the influence of the evolutionary concept, a thoroughgoing transformation of studies like law."
The law is not given by God. The law is simply something that human beings create to order their own society and lives. It's a human creation, not a divine creation. Thus, it can change. Easily it can change. When people talk about a living constitution, what they're saying is they believe that humans control the law, not God. And humans are the reference, they're the beginning and the ending, and they're in the middle. Whereas the viewpoint previous to the Darwinian thought was that humans actually discover the law that God had given.
Since society is constantly evolving, laws are periodically reinterpreted and modified by the society of the time. Evolving human organizations determine the legal principles and the moral codes. Therefore, secular humanist law is evolutionary law, determined by evolving man. Nothing is permanent. There are no absolute, unchangeable legal standards. There are no commands of God. Secular humanists reject biblical moral laws because they believe that biblical laws suppress people's natural appetite for pleasure. Morality and legality are viewed biologically, not theologically. Laws are man-centered, not God-centered. Humans must create their own legal system because only they know what is best for the society in which they live. While some secular humanists adhere to some forms of natural law, laws that are discovered in nature, they also combine this belief with legal positivism. This is because natural law ultimately implies a lawgiver, and secular humanists will not allow the possibility of an ultimate creator of law or an ultimate judge. Instead, secular humanists inevitably look to the state to create, enact, execute, and interpret law. They believe that human rights are simply the temporary provisions of a society and, generally speaking, granted by government.
With our contemporary view, if there's no God, then rights are arbitrary. Rights are relative. It's according to who's in power. And so if a government or individuals want to take away your rights, they have a right to because they're the ones that gave them to you to begin with.
Most secular humanists use politics to achieve one thing: a world government. Many humanists firmly believe that a world state is the next logical step on mankind's evolutionary road. They believe that every person must be committed to this end. Paul Kurtz. We need to build an ethical commitment to the world community as our highest moral devotion. World government is not just a desirable accomplishment for the humanist, it is mankind's highest moral calling. In the end, any act by an individual that hampers the move toward globalism is considered unethical and morally wrong.
I think one reason why secularists are so intent on globalism is because they have a vision for the world. I mean, it's not as though they come to this with a mind devoid of some intent. They actually have a vision by which they want the world to be governed. Now, they see themselves as governing it, you realize. It's an elitist view. It's a view that we know what's best for you, and if we can get this one world government, then we will control it to such an extent that anyone who disagrees with us obviously will be put into re-education centers or done away with in some way. But they believe they can bring to the world a better society. I really think most of these people really do believe that what they're doing will actually bring a better world.
Humanists believe that the state, when directed properly, becomes a progressive force in the evolution of man. To promote evolution effectively, nationalistic governments must fall, giving way to globalism and the world government. Julian Huxley. To have any success in fulfilling his destiny as the controller or agent of future evolution on Earth, man must become one single, interthinking group with one general framework of ideas.
Anytime you hear globalism or viewpoints like Huxley, they ultimately believe that they are the ones who are going to direct the evolution. It's not that human beings in general are directing evolution. It's an elite group that will direct evolution.
A world government is more possible today than at any time in the past. The world is much more interlinked, due largely to the advances in communications and travel technologies. There is a global economy. Individual economies are dependent on each other. When one falters, ripples are felt around the world.
While some secular humanists promote capitalism, most secular humanists advocate a socialist form of economics. They believe that man will one day have the perfect economy, and that economy will be socialistic. Many secular humanists believe that in order to reach our full potential as man in society, a government-planned and controlled economy is necessary.
Most of the early secular humanists were socialists. There's no doubt about that. John Dewey argued that sooner or later we would have socialism, call it what you will. In more recent times, because of the influx of some of Ayn Rand's followers in the secular humanist movement, socialism has been sort of put on the back burner. Some of them even argue for a democratic capitalistic position. But when you look at it historically speaking, many of the early founders of the secular humanist movement were indeed socialists.
Control of the economy by the state is key to a humanistic worldview. Man, who must save himself, must be in absolute control of all aspects of his universe. Under humanistic socialist central planning, only a few educated people will decide for the many. Eventually, mankind will evolve into a global society with a one-world government controlling a one-world economic system. Humanist Erich Fromm. We socialists are not ashamed to confess that we have a deep faith in man and in a vision of a new human form of society. Socialism is not only a socio-economic and political program, it is a human program, the realization of the ideals of humanism under the conditions of an industrial society. Because secular humanists hold to evolution, many are convinced that socialism is the next natural step in human evolution toward becoming better social beings. The theory of evolution plays a foundational role in the secular humanists' approach to history. They believe in historical evolution. They look to evolution to explain mankind's journey through time, as well as his progress into the future. History is understood in terms of the philosophical doctrine of naturalism and the evolutionary dogma of the survival of the fittest. Secular humanists believe, after the fittest survive, that history will bring a future paradise on earth, created and guided by a rational, scientific mankind. As the forces of evolution unfold throughout history, new species will certainly arrive and mankind will adjust. But as humans continue to develop their rational and scientific abilities, they will be able to guide evolution more effectively and more efficiently. Mankind's progress will not come about through any kind of divine intervention. Man's destiny is to be the sole agent for the future evolution of this planet. He is the highest dominant type to be produced by over 2.5 billion years of the slow biological improvement effected by the blind, opportunistic workings of natural selection. If he does not destroy himself, he has at least an equal stretch of evolutionary time before him to exercise his agency. Julian Huxley.
The hope of the secular humanist is that somehow impersonal forces and mindless forces of evolution are going to usher in a golden age of some kind, devoid, of course, of all stupefying religious teachings, including what John Dunphy would call the rotting corpse of Christianity.
The secular humanist worldview puts man at the center of the universe. It is a worldview that denies the existence of God and instead looks to evolved humanity for the answers to life's questions. Secular humanism stands in direct opposition to biblical Christianity. More importantly, secular humanism is, in fact, a religion. It is the dominant religious worldview in public schools today.